All right. Welcome to our 41st annual Seed Savers Exchange Conference. It's the second year we're doing it virtually. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Jeanine Scheffert. I am the Education and Engagement Manager here at Seed Savers Exchange. And I'm so excited about this year's lineup, and I'm excited about this session. Here with us, we have Kristen Loria, Bishop-von-Wettberg, Heron Breen, and Seed Savers Exchange Executive Director Emily Rose Haga. In this session, we're going to hear the beginnings of just how layered a seed story can be. And each of these panelists are going to tell us just a little bit about the beloved Jacob's cattle bean. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to all of you. If you do have questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll see if we end up having time for them in the end, and we'll get to any questions that we can. So thanks so much for being here. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jeanine, for the introduction, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today for this session. We're going to sit down for a good help in a bean stories from a round robin of different perspectives today. So I'll put up a PowerPoint presentation in just a second. But I want to let you know that some background about the Jacob's cattle bean here. It's a really well-known heirloom variety with over 200 years of documented history and a very, very special significance to the history of Seed Savers Exchange. It was once popular and common in the Maine bean culture as a regionally significant variety with various strains of the variety, but it's almost been lost multiple times during history. So its long history makes a powerful case study for us to ponder what a resilient seed system looks like, because different strains of the bean and their seed stories have survived thanks to many hands who have stewarded them along the way. But it also has a complex history, and its story is still unfolding as new and different perspectives emerge. And this special bean has chosen a few of us to help share its tale and give insight to how much we have to learn about each variety and how community participation matters to the long-term survival of regionally significant heirlooms that have become increasingly vulnerable in today's food and seed systems. So this is not going to be a talk where we're going to tell you the answers, but we're going to challenge you to, with some real-world examples and some real-world seed stories that can help you analyze what resilience looks like in your work and your community. So for the session, we have 4 people passing the mic in a round robin style to share multi-dimensional narratives. And we're each going to reflect on how has the Jacob's cattle bean touched each of us? How is it informing our seed work? And how do we see its future? So I'll begin by sharing some insight about its significance to the Seed Savers collection and how my own personal awareness of emerging seed stories behind the different varieties and strains in our Seed Savers collection is growing. Eric is going to tell you about some insights about his work with the Abenaki cultures of Vermont to explore the bean's indigenous stewardship history. Kristen will give some really interesting insights about her graduate research that she has done comparing different strains to elucidate the important role that seed stewards have in preserving diversity and how this can inform breeding work to help adapt these beloved varieties to different pressures and environments. And then Heron will close us off. He's a seedsman and a Mainer and the trial coordinator at Fedco Seeds, and he'll give us some anecdotes about its long history in Maine's bean culture and the seed trade. So I will start by sharing my screen so everybody can see our presentation. And does that show up for everyone? Great. So to begin, I'll share part of my personal story with you. So my story comes through the lens of an individual's experience with local and regional food traditions, and also as the executive director at a nonprofit organization dedicated to stewarding and sharing heirloom seeds and their stories. So growing up in the Midwest, baked beans and soup beans were definitely part of the New England and the Appalachian culinary traditions passed down in my family. And heirlooms specifically offered me a way of appreciating and connecting with those regional traditions on a deeper level. So I would always choose to purchase heirlooms whenever they were available locally. And Jacob's cattle bean was available in my area, But I also learned about other beautiful and rare bean varieties through my community, including a friend who had been collecting beans as a hobby. So then in 2012, I moved to Maine to be a plant breeder at Johnny's Selected Seeds. And the Maine bean culture there was instantly noticeable. There were big signs spray painted on the side of the road, advertising a bean supper. There were more diverse selections of heirlooms, more widely available in local grocery stores and the food and farming scene. I got to try a lot of different kinds: Maine yellow eye, the Marfax bean, the Lena Cisco's bird's egg bean, and the Jacob's cattle. But I even met in this Maine bean culture a man who was a multi-generational bean farmer who had been producing seeds of these varieties in his family for many generations. So my reaction to exposure to this bean culture was, wow, this is really cool, and I could really dig this. I mailed my grandma a care package from Maine back to Wisconsin with heirloom beans and a postcard all about it. So then in 2019, I moved to Iowa to take the role here at Seed Savers Exchange. And one of my first experiences here was working at the Harvest Festival event where we were featuring Jacob's cattle bean. So my role was to tell the story of the Jacob's cattle bean at the front of the soup line, where we were having a soup cook-off with some chefs and caterers and student groups. My first thought was, yes, I know this bean and I can speak to it personally. Plus, I learned more about its significance to Seed Savers Exchange for the first time. So it turns out the seed bank collection at Seed Savers today, which includes over 20,000 regionally, culturally, and historically significant varieties, has part of its origins in the Jacob's cattle bean. So John Withy was a bean collector who set out in the 1960s and 70s to reconnect with the Maine bean culture traditions of his family. He could no longer find a commercial source of Jacob's cattle bean, even though it was once common in his area, and he even grew it as a young market farmer. And he felt it was the best bean for using in Maine's bean hole tradition, a method of slowly baking beans in the ground. I'll show a picture of that. Here is a picture of John Withy. So he began collecting as a quest to find the Jacob's cattle bean, which led him to discover many, many other heirloom beans whose fates were similarly at risk in New England. And he began traveling and advertising across New England to collect these varieties, and eventually started a grassroots nonprofit group called Vonnegut Associates to help him collect and propagate the varieties. By 1981, he had over 1,000 varieties, but he was struggling to steward them as he aged and developed health issues. Seed Savers Exchange was emerging at that time as a leader in the heirloom seed movement with the nonprofit work to connect seed savers the world over to exchange varieties with each other. And John Withy donated his collection to Seed Savers Exchange. And this event would eventually lead to the creation of our public access seed bank, which is one of the most significant parts of our nonprofit mission. So the Jacob's cattle bean strains that were donated by Withy are known as Seed Savers Exchange bean number 1, bean number 2, bean number 148, bean number 889, bean number 918, and bean 1180. Besides those, we have 6 additional strains that have been donated to Seed Savers Exchange by our community with unique or sometimes unknown history. And here's a summary of the 12 strains of Jacob's cattle bean that we have in our collection. So at the same time I was learning about Seed Savers Exchange history with the Jacob's cattle bean, I was also reading a book called 7 Sisters of Seeds and Seeds of Renewal Project. And this was written by a man named Fred Wiseman. And I happened to be learning about some possible some indigenous connections to this variety. So this part of the story was not familiar at Seed Savers Exchange. It was something that would have been maybe otherwise left out of our part of the storytelling of the Jacob's cattle bean had it not been for the coincidence of me reading this book at the same time we were featuring it at our Harvest Festival. So the Jacobs cattle bean is a variety that Fred collected as part of his Seeds of Renewal project after he discovered its Wabanaki and Abenaki connections. He also was able to link the beanhole supper tradition to a well-known ancient indigenous method of cooking beans in an earth oven. So due to the Jacobs cattle beans popularity in Maine bean culture and the New England canning industry, he was able to easily find scholarly references with a lot of documentation related to a gasless version of the bean that was bred by a member of the Pike family who had been growing the original variety it was derived from over 200 years in Lubec, Maine, and said it was originally shared with their ancestors by the Passamaquoddy tribe in that region. And Dr. Wiseman described his motivation to carry out research that could recover unimproved versions of the strain that were as close to the original source as possible, challenge the widespread academic belief that agricultural traditions were not practiced in these tribal territories, and restore the Wabanaki traditions that had been lost within this culture. So this combination of experiences raised direct questions for me about the fact that there are many layers to a story depending on how far you peel back the proverbial onion. And these layers offer different lenses through which seeds and seed stories are collected and shared. How far you peel back the layers determines what voices or perspectives are represented versus what are missing. And how can organizations like Seed Savers Exchange, frequently viewed as an institutional pillar of seed preservation and histories research, help archive and share these different stories as they emerge and continue to evolve? Since then, Jacobs cattle bean has been continuing to lead me down a path of learning that is challenging my assumptions and growing my awareness of seed stories and their importance. So with that, I'll pass the mic to Eric, who can tell us a little bit about some of the research he is doing on this variety.
Thank you, Emily. So I come into this story, I think you can actually go back a slide, Emily. I think we have a repeat. So I pick up this story from Fred as well. I am originally from upstate New York. About an hour and a half from where Kristen will be joining us later, with parents who were, in Vermont, we would call them homesteaders, prepper hippies who wanted to move back to the land. We stored a lot of beans, some of which look like Jacobs cattle beans, but as transplants from Connecticut or St. Louis, my parents had lost any stories associated with them. I didn't think much of it, and I spent 7 years on the faculty of Florida International University in Miami, from starting in 2010, where I started a research program using wild chickpeas. And in that work, we were working with international gene banks like the USDA gene banks, but also the Vavilov Institute in Russia, which has a famous pre-Green Revolution collection by Nikolai Vavilov himself before he perished, was sentenced to death and perished in the Stalinist Gulag, as well as the Ethiopian National Gene Bank, the Turkish National Gene Bank. In 2017, we were able to move back to the Northeast, and I wanted to start work with crop varieties that were not well protected by gene banks, or where national level or international gene banks may have been overlooking the diversity that was there. And I learned of Fred's work with crop varieties from the Northeast, particularly from the Wabanaki communities and neighboring groups across Quebec, New England, and into New York. You can go to the next slide, Emily. So as I got to know Fred, we wanted to work carefully together to provide time for the blessing and permission of the Abenaki community for us to look at some of the diversity in the collection Fred had built from with his colleagues in Passamaquoddy, among the Mi'kmaq, the Abenaki, the Haudenosaunee, and others. We decided, given my past work in legumes, to take a look at the 19 varieties of beans that had been assembled in the Seeds of Renewal project. We, with permission, sent them off for sequencing. We're about to do it again. And what Fred was hoping we would do is use patterns of genetic diversity in these 19 varieties, as well as varieties of beans that a colleague in Italy, Roberto Papa in Ancona, has collected to understand the variation in land races of beans. We are in the midst of redoing that work. Some of it ran into COVID-related problems. So I don't have a finalized story, but a lot of this work on crop varieties is about stories. And I want to tell the story of one or two other varieties, as we'll cover the cattle bean well, which has a very rich story. But another one that has a great story, a sad story, is the Norridge Walk bean that was collected from the site of Norridge Walk on the Penobscot River, where in the 1720s, a mission and a native community of Penobscots was massacred. The bean was found later downstream of the village, presumably having survived since. And its resurrection shows that we can maintain some of the stories and traditions that may have been lost over time. In this work, I've been able to pull in some of the efforts of my students. Beck Morrow is a student of Indigenous descent who finished, she's now off in industry working, who was able to start some of this work with us. There may be a few other stories I should tell here. Actually, for the sake of time, so that there's a little more time for questions, I think I'm going to pass the end since my allergies are acting up. My apologies for the hoarse voice, but I spent yesterday out in a hemp field and that did not agree well with me. I'm going to pass things over to Kristen to pick up a different thread in our story.
All right. Thanks, Eric. So I jump into this story from the perspective of a master's student, trialing heirloom dry beans to determine what varieties might be well adapted to the Northeast United States. I was a graduate student in plant breeding and genetics, and we're interested in breeding improved dry beans for regional and specialty markets. And so in sort of assembling that collection and thinking about where all these varieties were coming from, a really big question popped up for me. And of course, when you buy a modern variety of cabbage from your seed catalog or whatever else, you have that tidy description of what that variety is. And that seed probably came from, potentially a really large seed company, and there's maybe only a few sources of that seed. And there's certification that tells you, the seed you're buying is the variety you think it is. And of course, none of that exists when you're trialing heirloom beans, especially one such as Jacob's cattle that has such a mysterious and long history. And so it got me thinking about, networks such as Seed Savers, how complex that history has been, and thinking about how much genetic diversity might be existing within one variety. And it's very common in genetics, as Eric talked about, to look at diversity between varieties, but there's almost this whole other layer underneath when you're thinking about seed stewardship across decentralized networks. And so I got talking with Heron and also some folks from Seed Savers And Jacob's cattle seemed like a great pick because it's pretty widely grown nowadays. It's an heirloom bean that more people know relative to other varieties. And so we figured if we're going to find sort of diversity there, Jacob's cattle would be a really good place to start. So we can jump to the next slide there. And so I kind of did like a snowball sampling. So again, working with Catherine from Seed Savers and Heron, we reached out to folks on the exchange, as well as growers, seed growers and farmers in Maine, because as Emily mentioned, Jacob's cattle has deep roots in Maine specifically, and there's still quite a number of growers producing Jacob's cattle commercially and saving their own seed. And so we really wanted to find seed that was being grown at the source that we were receiving it from, which is often not the case when you're buying seed from a seed catalog. And so we ended up with 18 sources, and you can see it's a real mix. There's different strains, as was mentioned as well. And they come from commercial seed companies. Some of them are big, some of them are really small and farm-based. We also, of course, got sources from the Seed Savers Exchange, which accounts for most of those seed saver categories. And then we also got the 2 accessions from the National Germplasm Repository that were associated with Jacob's cattle. So those are the 2 in the middle there. And so the idea was to think about, how much diversity are these seed saver sources adding to sort of our understanding of what Jacob's cattle is. If we only had the germplasm collection, or if we only had commercial seed companies, would we really be accessing whatever Jacob's cattle is in its pure form, whether that exists, would we be sort of missing out on any diversity? So yeah, we can go to the next one there. And so just to get you ready for the next few slides, a couple useful words that I'm going to throw around is first genotype, which is basically just the genetic makeup of a plant at a given place in its genome. And it can also refer to sort of many different genotypes, so kind of the plural version of that across the genome. And then the phenotype, in contrast, is the observable characteristic. So you have your gene, and then you have how it translates into some physical aspect of the plant. And that's a result of your gene, but also, of course, the environment where the plant is growing. And then a locus or loci refers to one or more specific locations in the genome. And you can go to the next. And so just to give you sort of a background before, which I should have done before I showed you this confusing thing. Basically what I did is I collected those seeds and did genetic sequencing. And so essentially what you're doing is you get this long code of A's and G's and C's and T's, and you're just comparing them from one source to the other to the other. And I genotyped 4 individuals of each seed source to see if they were different from each other, and then also compared them between sources. And so you'll see along those different colored dots are all my 18 sources. And then what this is called a principal components analysis. And what it does is it sort of draws out as much diversity as can be found in the data by contrasting all of those genotypes, and sort of maps out how things are related. And so you'll see along the x-axis, that first principal component, we're able to sort of parse out 31% of the diversity that was present across all of those seed sources. And so what you might have noticed, and then along the y-axis is a second component, and that is explaining 10% of the total diversity. And so what these sorts of graphs show us is how closely related seed sources are. And as you can tell in that bottom left corner, there's this really tight cluster of 14 sources, and those are all highly, highly related to each other. But then we see 4 other sources that are much more spread out, right? And especially this one in the lower right-hand corner. If we think about 31% of the diversity being explained by that gradient, that blue cluster in the bottom is quite a bit, very distinct from the other sources. And so this was really interesting because we thought it was very possible we would just see one cluster and they're all the same. And so this was a very exciting result. And so if you go to the next slide. And so what we can begin to do with that data is also kind of visualize it in a different way. And this is more familiar probably. So this is sort of a family tree essentially. What I did here was put some of the names of those strains, but also some photos of the seed. And because the next step after genotyping was to grow all of these seed sources in a common garden. So that means in one field, I grew out rows of all 18 sources. And so essentially we're eliminating, for the most part, the environmental effect on what the seed looks like. And so what we're seeing is, a pretty accurate representation of differences between those seed phenotypes, so what the seed looks like. And you can see that we're starting to get a clue that that genetic diversity we're seeing is translating to actual seed traits. Just a little sort of complication is the end of that branch, which is something called anasazi, you'll see. And that was because one of the germplasm collection sources was actually a mixture of seeds. So it was seed that was Jacob's cattle, and then clearly a different looking bean, similar colors, but what appeared to be anasazi, which some of you might have heard is a Southwestern traditional variety. And so that turned out to sort of spin an interesting story because anasazi is a highly distinct gene pool. So there's sort of 2 major domestications in bean. And so this gave us like a really interesting gradient to look at in terms of genetic distances that we might be observing. And so if you go to the next slide, I started to talk a little bit about seed phenotypes that we are seeing differences in. And so essentially we created clusters from that map we had. We ended up with 4 genetic clusters. And so when we started measuring traits in the field, we grouped all of our seed sources into those 5 clusters. And so that's what you see. You see 5 numbers along the x-axis on the bottom. And so we measured things like seed weight, number of pods per plant. We did some seed yield and stem length. And those are sort of commonly measured traits to assess diversity. And so basically what we found is some of those sources were quite distinct in the field as well for many of these traits, especially seed weight. So so several sources had significantly higher seed weights, and really more drastically, one source had a much lower seed weight. And that same genetic group also had higher stem length. So it was a taller plant and more pods per plant. And so, so if we go to the next slide, what the story that we started to get with that data was that some of these sources, especially that group with the really small, significantly smaller seed size and taller stem length, represents a pretty wide cross when we think about sort of genetic relationships. And so, so we ended up with essentially sources that were as distinct from the other strains as 2 completely different varieties of bean might be. And so really the story that makes sense to me is that some of these sources probably outcrossed, or maybe someone even intentionally crossed Jacob's cattle to, for example, a black bean, and then subsequently selected back towards what they saw to be Jacob's cattle. But a lot of that, highly unrelated variety was still present. And so, from a sort of plant breeding perspective, that's really interesting, because it's essentially a distinct variety completely, and it offers it brings in a lot of interesting sort of adaptive potential when you think about crossing two highly unrelated varieties of bean, and then allowing it to adapt to a new environment. And so we can go the next. What's next? And so the initial goal of this project was to essentially grow all these seeds out in a big garden, harvest the seed, and then give a mixed sample back to everyone that had sent seed to me. And I started to kind of get at this, but essentially the idea was, everyone, you saw that those 4 seeds from each source were very tightly clustered on the graph, right? So everyone's Jacob's cattle population was highly related. But if we are able to bulk this sort of crowdsourced population and send to everyone a diverse sample, it's sort of like starting fresh in allowing readaptation and kind of creating whatever Jacob's cattle, best fits your environment. And so the idea was essentially to do a sort of participatory project. And unfortunately, with COVID and disease contaminated seed grown in our beautiful wet New York summers, I wasn't allowed to send seed, which is a real shame. But the wonderful thing is that all of these sources are on either Seed Savers or are commercially available. And so these are highlighted, the 4 sources that were those distinct seed sources. And one of them came from Annapolis Seeds in Nova Scotia. That was the Winks Jacob's cattle. And then 2 in the middle are from a longtime Seed Saver member, Russ Crow. And the 4th was from a commercial farm. So that one is maybe not so available. But essentially, I think what I hope is inspiring is the idea that anyone can do this, really. You can source as many strains or sources of a variety as you want, and sort of recreate that experience. And so we can just pop to the next slide. I think I'm over time. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight Russ Crow because he has an incredible bean collection, and he made this study something it never would have been without his material. And he received a lot of that from that Withy collection that was mentioned. He's been a Seed Saver member since the 70s and has a website called A Bean Collector's Window. If you're interested in checking it out, it's wonderful. And a lot more information and confusing graphs can be found about the subject if you want on the my SARE report from my graduate work. So sorry for running over, but hopefully that wasn't too horribly over time. That's all.
Cool, Kristen, thanks. So my name is Heron Breen. I reside in central Maine, in St. Albans, which is in Abenaki land. And I'm going to share just sort of a brief overview of some of the history and sort of, I guess, the ethos of beans in Maine. And Maine is a short season. This is actually taken from this photo of these beans emerging out of the ground are actually taken from the very shores of the Kennebec River that Eric von Wettberg spoke of, where the massacre of the Morojwak Indians occurred. So this is actually, so in Maine, it's a very short season, and I know many of you garden in such a thing. And we have about a 2 or 3, maybe 3 week, but basically a 2-week window to get our beans in the ground and have them emerge and produce a wonderful food crop for us. As you can see, the strength of the bean pushing out through the ground and emerging and spreading its leaves is really like an iconographic. It's like an icon for seed saving, but also really an icon for all of us who work with seeds and who live in Maine and farm. I think this a lot of times, if you think about what attracts those of us in European culture to beans, is the same wisdom that the Native American cultures saw in the bean, which is this amazing resilience to just emerge and thrive and produce protein-rich food. So Jacob's cattle bean, go ahead, Emily. Next slide. This is an interesting reference book, which a lot of folks should take a look at, called Beans of New York. It's part of a series of books called The Vegetables of New York that were published in the 1930s. And they're an amazing series of books, this one particularly documenting all the beans that basically were known to have been cultivated all throughout New England. And they were all brought to an experiment station in New York and documented. And there's a number of basically photos that were taken black and white and then painstakingly hand painted. And all of the beans are described in an amazing, and all the vegetables in this series are in an incredible detail. The type of detail that basically folks like the USDA and seed savers hope to emulate in their documentation. And what we hear here is 1931, we start to see a description of Jacob's cattle bean. And it's saying, this bean with such unusual seed color is of unknown origin and quite local distribution in Maine. So at this time, this particular type of bean was really only known in Maine and was very distinct. There's some semblance here of maybe it's related to some other beans, but at the time, bean experts, and you have to realize at this time there were such people. Everybody was basically a bean expert because heirloom beans were in everybody's community and within everyone's memory. And folks were very familiar with the diversity of beans and also the diversity of preparing these beans. And Jacob's cattle, of course, with this unusual, and it says a solid, irregularly margined blotch of brownish crimson. So we start to hear at this point that actually this bean is actually fairly rare in 1931 in this documentation. It's not widely distributed. It's not widely known outside of Maine. Go ahead, Emily. I guess I'll just keep talking. I don't know if I have any other slides to share in this space, but what I'd like to do is just walk you a little bit backwards from this point where we are. This bean in European culture, its history in Maine begins with a transfer of some sort of this bean from the Passamaquoddy tribe to a family, the Clark family. Now, the story goes that a Joseph Clark, who I believe the number is that he was born, and I'm just going to reference a little document here so I don't get this wrong, in 1788 in Lubec, Maine. And Lubec, Maine is what's called Down East Maine. It's the part of Maine that's actually all the way over towards Canada. So this is a space where there's a very unique climate and there's a very unique culture. And you can see the Passamaquoddy community on this map of this slide that Emily has pulled back is over in that sort of Machias area, as they call it. But Lubec is where these folks had landed. Joseph Clark, the Joseph Clark Jr.'s father had showed up there in the sort of mid 1780s, right around the time that his son Joseph was born. And there was a sense here that this was a transfer, whether gift or otherwise, based upon the first European male child born. Interestingly enough, the mother of Joseph Clark, the supposed recipient of this bean, has a name, Abigail Tumblestone. And there's no genealogical history related to that person. And I will relate to folks that the word tumblestone is an old Maine word that actually refers to beach stone that is smoothed by the waves. And if anyone has been to down East Maine, they know of a place called Jasper Beach, or Jasper, which is an incredibly beautiful, incredibly smooth stone. There's some sense that we're trying to get to the bottom of, that maybe actually what is happening here is actually that Abigail Tumblestone may have been actually a Passamaquoddy woman, and that the beans were brought into the Clark family through her heritage. But in that space, Joseph Clark the Jr. Has a daughter named Diana, who marries into this very interesting family, the Pike family, who is also settled in Lubec. And the Pike family has a history of using the word of the family name Jacob. And what is the Diana's husband, whose name is Jabez, also nicknamed Jacob. His brother was named Jacob and actually was a famous sea captain who died at sea in sort of a famous accident, and continues to name his own son Jacob. Jabez, also known as Jacob, the husband of Diana, had some dealings. There was some sense that there was at that time, and that this is around in the 1850s, that he was also a butcher and a proprietor, and like had basically dealt in cattle. At the time, there was sort of some cross-border trade that might have been illicit. And so this part of Maine, and Maine in general, the coastal and island culture, were basically as far out of reach of law as you could get. And folks kind of did by their honor, but also kind of by their wits. And there's some stories that basically the relationship of the word Jacob's cattle is a reference to this Jabez / Jacob and his involvement with cows. And this community, a lot of the Scots-Irish, the Ayrshire cow is basically a cow that has the same speckling as this bean. And this would have been kind of the elite cow that folks would have referenced as cattle. So while there might be a biblical play on words, it may very well be that the Jacob's cattle is an actual person and a reference to a family name that was brought into a European family through the Clark family and onward. The Clark family is an interesting family. The next Jacob Pike, the son of Jabez, became a state legislator and a sea captain, and was known to bring his beans with him throughout his journeys. And basically there was a culture at the time of people sort of basically either gambling with their beans, basically for fun, or sharing each other's beans, because almost everybody in New England at that time had beans from their local community. And it was kind of partly collecting, but partly trading back and forth. And there's some sense that this may be how this bean kind of was sort of distributed throughout Maine, or gifted throughout Maine. The Pike family also had some pretty interesting folks down the next chain. The son of this Jacob, Sumner, Alger, and Radcliffe. Sumner Pike served both Truman and Roosevelt, both on the Security and Exchange Commission and the Atomic Energy Commission, and earned his money in oil and on the stock market, but basically retired back to the Down East area in Lubec. Radcliffe went forth and was a plant breeder at UNH, the University of New Hampshire. And Alger was the farmer. Radcliffe bred a bean called the gasless cattle, which was part of what Kristen was looking at in her story. And I want to pull a little head to that list of the different beans that you have. There we go, the 12 strains. You'll find that bean number 1 is this Jacob's gasless cattle, which is a cross between a black bean and Jacob's cattle that was made by Alger Pike, the kind of like stewards of this variety. Now, if you go back to that one slide just one more time, you'll notice that you'll see bean number 1, that has a connection to the Pike family. Bean number 2 says from the Pike family to John Withy. Bean number 148, Hepler's, says that the late Professor Hepler was the heirloom bean specialist at UNH. very likely probably got that strain of Jacob's cattle from his colleague, Radcliffe Pike, who was also at the university at that time. And you start to realize that not only did these people know each other, but they were probably sharing a similar, if not the same bean from the same source or from the same community. So this bean travels and has had this wonderful illustrious story. And we find ourselves in an interesting place where we assume this bean is now commonplace. But the truth is, there's actually only probably, as I know, in Maine, maybe a handful, a half dozen or more farmers who are actually growing this bean on a scale that would be provided for food. While you can buy some of these seeds in seed company, packets, this bean is still incredibly rare. And probably more rare is that it's probably, I would be challenged to say who is growing it down east. And so the question is sort of, to me, about whether the strains is it'd be interesting to take all these different strains and see which one of them grew well in down east Maine. And sort of, when we talk about the phenotype, there's a very specific climate in this place. And there's a very specific community and specific soils, and some of this G by E relationships that Kristen was talking about. It would be interesting to see which of these strains may actually do well and Seed Savers keeping this history has been incredibly important to the stories that Kristen and I and others are telling on this. So thank you so much for letting me kind of weave a little tale there of the folks that have touched this bean and the families involved, and please do your own research into some of these families, these folks that have touched this bean, the Professor Hepler, the Meter family who's been involved in this bean, the Pike family who's been involved in this bean. These are some pretty interesting folks. And somehow you kind of wonder, is it the folks who are interesting, or is it the bean that they touched that helps make them so interesting? That's my story.
All right, thank you so much to Kristen and Eric and Heron for those great stories. Hopefully these examples have raised a lot of questions for you all. Everybody's given us a lot of good food for thought from this big baked bean pot today. The purpose of the stories was to challenge you to think about some different things, the complexity of different stories and experiences surrounding even one variety, how stories are still emerging about this fairly well-known bean even today, shifting our perspectives. The significance of the historical, cultural, and social lens of the storytellers and what information that does or doesn't tell us, how tenuous our relationships can be, even with the more widespread heirlooms within a region at different points in time as history and society ebbs and flows. The importance of the stories and traditions and keeping those connections strong really matters. What a resilient seed community does or doesn't look like through a case study of the past, present, and future of a single variety of multiple perspectives is what we've given you today to think about. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Emily Rose, Eric, Heron, and Kristen. We really appreciate how you've woven all of these different pieces of this story together. Thanks for being here, and thank you to all of the panelists. Really appreciate it.